Well, it's time for lecture number 8. Today's topic, the First World War. Several topics will be addressed in this presentation. First, we're going to look at the causes of the war, some long-term as well as short-term factors that led to the conflict. Next, we'll look at the war itself and explore some battles. Not a tremendous number, but we'll look at some highlights, and then we'll look at some of the new technologies that were applied to warfare. Then we'll explore the impact of war on the home front and on civilian populations, and then address some final results of the war. One of the long-term factors that led to the war was the development of an alliance system. Once again, here's a map that was shown several times in the last presentation. It shows Europe in 1815. Notice that there was no country of Germany and there was no country of Italy. These were separated into different kingdoms. By 1871, Germany and Italy had unified. See, what had happened is that prior to the unification of these countries, there was a balance of power in Europe. The creation of Germany and Italy upset the balance of power that had been in place ever since the fall of Napoleon in 1815. Once again, here's a figure from the previous lecture. This is Bismarck. He was the Prime Minister of Prussia who led Germany's unification. Again, here are some of the highlights of the Franco-Prussian War, which resulted in the unification of Germany. It also poisoned French-German relations for decades. Due to the rise, particularly of Germany, an alliance system evolved in Europe. On the one hand, Germany led one set of allies. These included Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and Italy. The British led the other system. Their main allies were the French, Russians, and Serbs. This political cartoon identifies the tangled web of alliances that were common right on the eve of the First World War. In the middle, causing all this controversy, were the Germans. And then if you go clockwise, we've got Russia, as signified by the bear. We've got Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire. And then Italy. And then the British. Off to the side were the French, who initially were isolated from the others. Now, you may or may not be familiar with the figure of Marianne. She was often associated with France, and it comes from this painting here from the era of the French Revolution. Even today, in some cases, the French are portrayed by this figure of Marianne. Another long-term cause of the First World War was an arms race. Several factors were involved in this arms race. The British knew that they could never have as large of an army as some of the other countries because they were an island nation, so they adopted a two-power navy standard. Their navy was going to be as large as any other two countries' navies combined. Toward that end, they began to develop what were called dreadnoughts. These were ships, battleships, built strictly for warfare. Here we see an example of one of these dreadnoughts, the HMS Invincible, owned by the British. In its speed and firepower, it made all other naval vessels obsolete. By 1914, the British had 29 ships, and the Germans had 18. Each country also had several under construction at the same time. Another example of this arms race, as it seemed as if countries were preparing for war, was that several nations had large standing armies on the eve of the war. For example, in France, they had a standing army of 3.5 million, while the Germans had 3.8 million in their armies. In both countries, just about all able-bodied men had some sort of a military requirement. Why did they need these large armies unless they were preparing for war? Another long-term cause of the war was nationalism. Now, the region where this issue of nationalism became important was in the Balkans, where the country of Yugoslavia was, and it's circled here on this map. Here's a close-up of the Balkans. For many years, I mean hundreds of years, this region was under the control of foreign nations. For centuries, the foreign power that controlled that region of the Balkans was the Ottoman Empire. As the Ottoman Empire began to fail, by the early 1900s, they were replaced in the region by Austria-Hungary. The people living in that area of the Balkans had one goal. They wanted self-rule. They wanted to kick all of those foreign countries out. We're going to see how this desire for nationalism and independence impacted the war as well. Next, I'd like to explore the final spark that led to the war. The spark involved the man shown here. His name was Franz Ferdinand, along with his wife. He was the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary is included in the circled area of this map. The star that just came in identifies the city of Sarajevo, which is where Franz Ferdinand and his wife traveled. As Ferdinand and his wife participated in a parade down the streets of Sarajevo, shots rang out, and he and his wife were both assassinated. This was in June of 1914. The perpetrators were Serbian terrorists. In case you're interested, there's a hyperlink on Canvas identifying the events of that day. It's quite remarkable. Following the murder of a prince of Austria-Hungary, as one could imagine, the government of Austria-Hungary wanted vengeance. That's where the alliance system fit in. See, this conflict initially just involved Austria-Hungary and Serbia. But then Austria-Hungary went to their allies and they said, "Hey, Germany, are you going to back us up? We had our prince killed." And they went to the Italians and the Turks. And then the Serbs went to their allies, the Russians, and they said, "Are you going to back us up? Are you going to help us out?" Who went to the French? And the French went to the British. And eventually, what eventually happened is that we see, as a result of the alliance system, the development of the Allied powers and the Central powers. All of Europe became embroiled as a result of this alliance system. Now we will review some of the highlights of the war. When one explores the Battlefront, initially what was clear was that the Germans were very successful, although they did undertake a controversial tactic. French defenses along their border with Germany were quite strong, so the Germans undertook what was called the Schlieffen Plan. Rather than invading France directly, they went through the neutral country of Belgium. This was controversial because it made the Germans look to be the strong aggressors in this case, because Belgium's neutrality had been an important concept for about 100 years throughout European history. While the German invasion was initially successful, the French stood strong and they maintained a protective border around Paris, and eventually trench warfare and stalemate ensued. Trench warfare became the norm on the Western Front, and the arrow here points to the furthest German advance in the fall of 1914. Notice it did not encompass Paris. These images help to show what trench warfare was like. An elaborate network of trenches on either side of the line were developed by the Germans as well as the French. Next, I'd like to identify some of the new technologies that were used during the First World War. The development of these new technologies had a major impact on the war. Those products of the Industrial Revolution were applied to the art of warfare. There were several examples of these new technologies. One is shown here. The U-boat, underwater boat, or the submarine, was used by the Germans. Airplanes were also used for the first time in warfare. We see a German plane on the upper left and an Allied plane on the right. These were great offensive weapons, and you see on the left a British plane dropping a torpedo. And on the right, machine guns were placed on the planes, and they could be devastating. Different defenses were developed in order to fight these planes, and an anti-aircraft gun is shown here on the left. And if it was successful, you see the result of that on the right. Some rudimentary tanks also were used. This is a British tank from the war. The use of the machine gun probably led to more deaths than any other factor. On the left, you see the gun itself, and as different troops tried to go from their trenches and they tried to attack others, they were just mowed down by men manning those machine guns. Poison gas also was used by the Allies and the Central Powers. In order to protect against these gases, gas masks were developed. And because horses also were used during the war, you can see this gas mask is being applied to a horse. While many feared the use of these gases, probably only about 3% of the deaths from the war were caused due to poisonous gas. Here we see some German soldiers improvising face masks. As long as you were to dip those masks in your own urine and breathe through that, you could survive a gas attack. Let's look at the involvement of the United States here next. This portrait identifies the President of the United States at the beginning of the war. His name was Woodrow Wilson. He identified one goal. He called upon Americans to remain neutral in thought as well as in action when it came to the war. While Wilson called for this, the United States had closer relations with the British and strong economic ties. One thing that the Americans did not support was the declaration of a submarine warfare zone around the British Isles. The Germans declared that if any American ship was to come into that area, it could be attacked. Into this controversy sailed the Lusitania. This was a British passenger ship. It was scheduled to travel from New York to the British Isles. Many Americans were warned not to go on the ship because it would enter that German submarine warfare zone. This is an advertisement taken from an American newspaper. The arrow is pointing to a notice. It's warning Americans that a state of war exists between the British and the Germans. This was actually paid for by the German embassy, and they suggested that people not go on this ship. Some Americans heeded the warning and decided not to go on the ship. However, many did set sail. In 1915, the ship was attacked by the Germans. About 1,200 people died. Over 100 of the victims were Americans. As a result of this, Germany pledged to stop its unrestricted submarine warfare. Well, the Germans did stop their warfare for about 2 years. Eventually, they resumed it, and due to some other factors as well, the United States eventually entered the war in 1917. Here we see several American tanks that are an example of some of the supplies that the Americans were able to provide for the Allied powers during the war. Now I'd like to look at the impact of World War I on the home front. The first issue to be explored would be the impact of the war on traditional women's roles. The number of women working outside the home increased dramatically during the war. For example, in Great Britain, the government denied contracts to businesses that did not hire female employees. By the end of the war, probably at least 1/3 of the workforce in different defense plants was made up of women. A good example is shown on the right. The Krupp Munitions Works was an important German factory. They had 0 women working for them prior to the war. By its end, there were 12,000 female employees. These images show the involvement of women in a variety of ways. On the left, we see women working in an assembly line on a defense plant. And on the right, we see a poster encouraging women to work in some of these munitions plants. Everyone could contribute to the war effort, even if they weren't a soldier fighting on the field of battle. Here, several women in Germany are making bullets. Another impact of the war on the home front was seen with food shortages. The traditional agricultural economy in many communities was interrupted by battles, in some cases on the fields where they used to grow crops. Look at the image on the left. You see the devastation caused by warfare. Could you imagine going back and trying to grow crops there? On the right, we see another image. These are Belgian troops, and they're in a beet field, setting up a machine gun, waiting for a battle to commence. Due to the interruption of the agricultural markets, there was less food for people to eat. Probably the country that had the best planned economy was Germany, and we'll see how the German people really suffered. In 1916, because there wasn't very much food for them, the government issued a ruling that people should have access to 1,350 calories per day. By 1917, this had been dropped to 1,000 calories a day. Today, generally speaking, they argue that you should get about 2,000 calories a day. So you can see how this led to a lot of suffering. As a result of the war, probably about 750,000 German civilians died. One last thing that we'll see was that propaganda was quite common during the war. They didn't have 30-second TV commercials during the First World War, but they did have posters. On the left, we see a poster identifying and encouraging people to come to a public meeting as they were recruiting for members of His Majesty's Army. On the right, we see a huge lineup of men who are getting ready to enlist. Here we see some additional British recruiting posters. These were common throughout the empire. Not only does the empire need men, but women could also encourage their husbands or brothers or cousins or other men that they knew to serve in the armed forces. The British weren't the only ones who were developing these pieces of propaganda. These are both from Germany. On the left, we see a poster declaring that the fatherland is in danger. Everyone should contribute to the war effort. And on the right, a recruitment for the German cavalry. I don't have a translation for each of these, but I think the message is clear. On the left, we see a German soldier who's defeating the Russians, the French, and the British. Do you get the message for the one on the right? Jesus is on our side. The Americans developed their posters as well. How do you like this one on the left? Gee, I wish I were a man. I'd join the Navy. And then we see a rekindling of Uncle Sam. I like this one on the left. It's trying to encourage Americans to watch what they're doing because he's watching you. But does it look a little spooky and remind you of somebody else? I thought this was cool. Well, by 1918, the war had finally come to an end. I hope you like this headline from the Ludington Daily News taken from November 11th, 1918. That's when a ceasefire agreement went into effect, effectively ending the war. There were several results as a result of the war. An incredibly high death toll. Between 10 and 13 million people died. Many of those were civilians. Germany and France in particular were devastated by the war, as about a third of all men between 20 and 33 died. Up to the First World War, there was a tremendous belief or faith in progress. This optimism was destroyed by the incredibly high death rates. I'm often uncomfortable simply showing statistics, but I think that these statistics are very telling. These are taken from the textbook for the course, and they identified the tremendous death rates for many European nations. Yes, over 100,000 Americans died during the war, but this was 1/10 of 1%. Other countries were devastated. France would never be the same. I'd like to end with some concluding thoughts. So over the course of the presentation, we've seen some long-term causes of the war and the spark that caused it. We see the application of new technologies to the art of killing people. We also see the impact of the war on the home front. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to evaluate, what do you think was the most important result or outcome of the war? Well, that's it for today. Take care. I hope you learned something new, and we'll see you soon.